In the world of gaming today, high FPS is all the rage. There's people who go out there and buy 144 Hz monitors just so they can get the smoothest experience out there. We trash on the current generation of consoles because some games just can't hit 30 FPS, let alone 60. And there's people like me who will take their GTX 1080, overclock it a little bit, and even though they're on a 60 Hz panel, they will try and get the highest FPS possible by turning down all the settings in their games. But why is that? We all know high FPS is important. It gives a smooth feeling to the game that we play, and because our monitors are 60 Hz, 60 FPS gives us a pretty smooth experience with no screen tearing or any of those other factors that might come along unless your monitor's just whack. 60 FPS gives games just a really smooth experience overall, but what about the people who want to go higher than that, even if they don't have a higher refresh rate on their monitor? In a video by 3 Clicks Philip, he goes in and tries to figure out if high FPS actually does matter. He comes out and says that it does, and in higher FPS situations, like let's say if you were getting 300 for some situations, it just feels smoother than 144 even if your monitor is only at 144 Hz. The game is already pretty smooth when it's synced to your monitor's refresh rate, but why does it feel better when it's higher than that? G-Sync and FreeSync try to make the game feel as smooth as possible by eliminating screen tearing by adjusting the monitor's refresh rate based on how many frames per second your card is outputting and the mins and max of how the technology is implemented on the monitor. But what if I told you that that's not really the best way to get the best playing experience possible? I mean, if this technology was perfect, we'd see pro Counter-Strike players just playing on those monitors within that acceptable frame rate range, because if they're going to turn down all their settings to the lowest quality possible, playing 4x3 stretch, there's no reason for them to have those monitors. The technology just doesn't work at that frame timing. In order to understand why players would choose to have a really high FPS even if it were to break their FreeSync or G-Sync barrier or just their monitor's refresh rate in the first place, we have to try and figure out how games work. When games are programmed, there's usually 3 distinct ways in how they program, how their physics work, how the player interacts, etc. The first way a developer will make a game is by tying everything to the physics engine. Older Japanese PC game ports, Bethesda games, and GameWorker games in general will usually have this kind of thing going on. This is where inputs, physics, how everything interacts with each other is tied to frame rate. Let's take a look at this example I made in GameMaker, where I run right in both 30 FPS and 60 FPS, at least according to the game's logic. As you can see, the higher frame rate makes everything go faster. This is generally a really bad way to program games, and most AAA games don't follow this rule set. The next one is to have physics in a separate thread, but again, game inputs tied to frame rate. You'll see this a lot in competitive games where you, as someone with like 20 milliseconds of ping, is kind of acting normally, but somebody with 600 is just kind of flying around the map everywhere. Because the server isn't getting pinged as often, it's getting a lot less input data than somebody with a lower ping. Because there's a lot less input being sent to the server, he might be jumping around 15 foot in front of him instead of the 5 that he wanted to. This kind of works the same way as like your FPS, so the higher your FPS, the more inputs per second the game will interpret. The last way a game might be programmed, which is kind of not as common as it should be, is subframe input. This is where input and maybe in physics or something are put in a different thread that is updated independently of how many frames you see on your screen. This is really great as it can make everything update at a really high refresh rate compared to how many frames your GPU can put out. So if you're cool with having 30 frames per second like in your game for some godforsaken reason, your input will still be calculated about maybe like 5 to 1,000 times depending on how the developer wants to do that. The only game that I know about that has subframe input would have to be Reflex Arena. It's a really cool old school shooter. I've looked into it, haven't bought it yet though, but if you want to try and look into this, see if it improves your gameplay, I would definitely look into it. Now, while I wouldn't definitely just like take my word for it, I would definitely check out again that video by 3 Clicks Philip where he did the frame analysis trying to figure out why it felt smoother at high refresh rates, and I think this is why. It's because the game doesn't independently update game inputs from how many frames per second is being pushed out in the GPU. If they're tied together, it makes for an almost sluggish experience, especially if you're playing at like 30 FPS on a really low-end rig. I don't know why you would try and play a competitive shooter at anything but 60 FPS, especially on a 60 Hz monitor. High frame rates is really important in competitive games, especially in games like Counter-Strike or Call of Duty or maybe even the new Quake and Unreal. I don't know how they're specifically programmed, at least the newer ones, but CSGO, you have to really have a high refresh rate if you want to have the most nuanced control. So definitely keep that in mind next time you see somebody running low settings. It might not just be to see things easier, it might have an actual competitive advantage, even if you're only playing on a 60Hz monitor. Maybe you could try this on a newer game too, like Overwatch. I don't know how much Blizzard has dabbled in FPS outside of this game. I think this might be their first FPS, but I would assume that it would still have the same constraints that most games have, because not a lot of games have subframe input. Again, games like Counter-Strike, Overwatch, any competitive shooter really, anything that requires you to try and have really precise controls will benefit from a high refresh rate beyond being able to see everything at really low settings. You're going to be able to do flick shots easier or something, be op easier. It all just depends on how good you are with the controller as well, but you'll definitely get a slight advantage. But that's just me. That's what I think. That's what I've kind of got together from all the information that I found on the internet and just playing myself. What do you guys think? Tell me down in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Check out one of these videos. This one's going to be one I recommend to you, and this one is going to be something YouTube tells you to go watch. And have fun. I'm gregandcin, I'm out.